Welcome everyone to today's Interspecies Conversations lecture. My name is Cristian Hernandez-Blick, head of program here at Interspecies Internet. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the trustees and the organization to another edition of our monthly speaker series. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, this talk is part of a regular series of online lectures titled Interspecies Conversations, which invites leading professors, scientists, researchers, and students to share work that contributes to advancing our understanding of communication in other species, as well as adjacent topics related to non-human animal cognition, behavior, and welfare. We aim to showcase emerging ideas and discoveries and host open discussions where our community can join the conversation with ideas and feedback. So joining us today is Mickey Pardo. Pardo is a behavioral ecologist and bioacoustician interested in the intersection of animal communication, cognition, and conservation. He earned his PhD in behavioral ecology from Cornell University, where he studied both vocal communication and social cognition in both Asian elephants and acorn woodpeckers. He completed a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship at Colorado State University on vocal communication in African elephants, working in collaboration with Save the Elephants in Kenya. He is currently a postdoctoral associate at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where he is using passive acoustics and AI to monitor bird populations. In his talk today, Mickey will explore research conducted by him and his colleagues, investigating the possibility of name-like calling in wild African elephants. So using machine learning algorithms, Pardo and his team found that elephants seem to use personalized calls to address members of their group, suggesting that elephants use arbitrary vocal labels for identifying individuals, a rare ability among non-human animals. And this recent discovery received extensive media coverage, and we are delighted to have Mickey with us here today to walk us through the science and implications of this breakthrough. Mickey, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. So I'm gonna share my screen and hopefully we can get that going. Okay, can you all see the screen? Just give me a thumbs up if you can see it.
We can see it.
Okay, cool. I don't know why it's it's stuck in the middle of the presentation for some reason. Okay, let's try that again. Sorry. Okay. Huh. Well, I'll just scroll back to the beginning. You get a little bit of a preview of the whole presentation. Okay, so basically, as Cristian said, I'm going to talk about a study that I did recently addressing whether elephants use name-like calls to call different members of their family group. So first of all, names are of interest for a number of reasons, but primarily I think because there's something that's so integral to our own society and in our own biology as a species. So names do a few different things for us as humans. One is that they allow us to keep track of all of the different complex social relationships that we have. And two is that they facilitate cooperation. So one study found that when a professor, so they sort of created this study where a professor would call a student either by name or not by name, sort of simulating whether they remembered the student's name or not. And they found that people were much more likely to be willing to comply with a request when someone remembered their name than when they didn't remember their name or when they just addressed them without their name. So that suggests that hearing our name kind of makes us feel more positive feelings toward the person who used it and makes us more willing to cooperate with them. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because if somebody's put in the time learn your name, that's sort of an honest signal of some degree of investment that they've made in that relationship with you. So names really help us cement our existing relationships, and they facilitate cooperation, and high levels of cooperation are actually something that we as humans have in common with elephants. So there are a few examples of name-like calls in other species. One is bottlenose dolphins. So bottlenose dolphins, as well as some other species of dolphins, have these calls called signature whistles, which are basically a whistle that is primarily only produced by a single individual. So each dolphin has their own unique whistle, and they use that as sort of a calling card to identify themselves to others. So they produce their own whistle to broadcast their own identity to other dolphins. And then occasionally a dolphin will mimic the signature whistle of somebody else, usually someone that they're closely bonded to. And it seems that they use this to address them essentially by name. So usually these signature whistles are produced by the owner of the whistle, but sometimes they're imitated by other dolphins to call the owner of the whistle by name. And parrots also do something similar. So in orange-fronted parakeets, for example, they also have unique contact calls, and every individual has their own individually specific call, and they imitate each other's contact calls in vocal interactions. It's a little bit different than what the dolphins do. So what it seems like the parakeets are doing is that when two flocks are interacting with each other, they will make their contact calls more similar to each other. So they're both simultaneously imitating one another, as sort of a means of signaling that they want to join their flocks. And if they want to separate their flocks, they make their contact calls more and more dissimilar from one another over the course of the interaction. So the idea is that they're addressing one another by imitating the calls of the individual they're trying to address, similar to dolphins, although the exact way that that manifests is a little bit different in parrots compared to dolphins. But either way, in both dolphins and parrots, the way that these animals address each other is by imitating a call that's primarily associated with the individual they're trying to address. There we go. Now, this is a little bit different from how names and words in general work in human language. So most words in human language are arbitrary in structure, meaning that there's no inherent connection between the sound properties of the word or the name and the thing that it refers to. There are exceptions, of course. So like you have onomatopoeia, like words like swish or bang that imitate a sound and refer to the sound iconically by imitating the properties of the thing they're referring to. But most words in human language are arbitrary. And this is important because it's part of what allows us to communicate about such a wide range of things. If you think about it, if we could only talk about things by imitating the properties of the thing we're referring to in some way, that would limit the number of things we could talk about. So arbitrariness is thought to be a really key component of human language. And if we could find evidence for arbitrary labels, that is, labels that do not rely on imitation of the thing they refer to in other species, this could be really valuable for trying to understand the selection pressures that led to the evolution of this ability in our own species, and it could help us understand the evolution of language. So that brings me to African elephants, my study species. So there's a number of reasons why we might think that names could be particularly useful for elephants. So number one, at least in African savanna elephants, which is the species that I studied, they have extremely large and complex social networks. So females and males live separately once they're adults. And in female society, it's structured in a sort of nested way. So you have core family groups of closely related females and their offspring, and you have bond groups, which are related family groups that associate with each other preferentially. And then bond groups associate with other bond groups to form these larger units called clans. And so you have this sort of complex layering of society, and the elephants can recognize all these different individuals and have different relationships with different members of their social network. They're also often out of sight of their bonded social partners because they don't always travel together with their whole social network at once. Instead, they have a fission fusion society where they split apart and then come back together And so they're often communicating with one another when they can't see each other. So being able to address communication to specific individuals could be particularly valuable for them. And then finally, elephants are among the few mammals that are capable of mimicking sounds that they don't produce innately. And that's something that is a critical prerequisite for human language. And it seems likely that vocal mimicry, or at least the ability to learn to produce new sounds, is necessary to have names, because it's hard to imagine how an animal could be born knowing the names for all of their future social affiliates. Names, almost by definition, have to be learned. And the fact that elephants have this unique ability to learn to produce new sounds means that at least they have some of the prerequisites to have names. So when people typically think of an elephant call, they think of a trumpet, which is this sort of high frequency, brassy call that the elephants make, usually when they're excited or upset about something. But actually, trumpets are not the most common calls that elephants make. They're really more like emotional outbursts. And it's a little bit like thinking of the quintessential elephant call as being a trumpet is a little bit like thinking of the quintessential human vocalization as like a scream or crying. It's something we do a lot, but it's not the most interesting thing that we do, and it's not even the most common thing that comes out of our mouth. So the most common call type that elephants make are rumbles, which are these low frequency harmonic calls that are actually quite complex in structure, and they produce them in almost every behavioral context. And I'll play it for you, and keep in mind that you're actually only hearing a tiny part of the call, because a good part of this call is below the range of human hearing, and an even larger portion of the call is not going to come out of typical laptop speakers. You would need a specialized speaker to even reproduce the full call, and even then, your ears won't be able to hear 100% of it. So this is what the part that we can hear sounds like. Huh, did not seem to work. It was working before when we tested it earlier. So
I think
yeah, I don't
maybe
know why this is. Yeah, sorry, Christian.
I think if you stop sharing, share again, and select the audio sharing function.
I did select that when I shared the screen.
Okay.
Let's try it again. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not playing, but it sounds like it's described. It's a rumble. It's a sort of like sounds almost like rolling thunder or something. Very very low frequency call. And so these calls are produced in a variety of different contexts. And in our study, we looked at three contexts specifically, which are the contexts where we thought that names might be most useful. So one of them is a long distance contact call. And this is calls that elephants make to get in touch with members of their family who are out of sight. So these are typically very loud calls, and they're projected over long distances. So it makes sense you would use names in that context where you're trying to get the attention of someone who you can't see and who can't see you. The second context is greeting calls, which are close distance calls produced when two individuals who are bonded to each other come together within touching distance after some period of separation. And then the third context is caregiving rumbles, which are rumbles that adult females or adolescent females make to young calves in a caregiving context. So when they're nursing the calf or when they're comforting the calf after the calf experienced distress or something like that. So unfortunately, I don't think the sounds are working. We can try it here, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be playing. But basically, I was going to just show you these are two individuals from a family called the Artist Two in Samburu, where I conducted this work, and we call them Donatella and Rothko, but obviously that's not what they call each other. And so I was going to play the calls that a single female named Frida, who is a member of the same family, used to address these two different elephants. And the point was that when you listen to them as a human, the calls sound very similar. It's very hard to hear differences between the calls. You can hear some, but it's not super obvious. And so that's why we ended up using machine learning in this analysis, because human ears are just not that great at discerning patterns in calls that we can't even hear the full call to begin with. So I had 5 objectives for this study. The first objective is to figure out if elephant calls contain acoustic variation that's specific to the individual receivers. In other words, is there any information in the call that could convey the name of the intended receiver? Number 2, if the calls do contain such information, when do elephants use these names? 3, do different callers use the same name for the same receiver, like in humans, or do they use different names for the same receiver? So sort of like if everybody came up with their own nickname for a given receiver. 4, are elephants imitating the calls of the receiver in order to address her, like in dolphins and parrots, or are they using arbitrary names like humans? And then 5, the question is, do elephants actually respond to these names that may exist in their calls? Because that's kind of the key component. It's fine to find patterns in the data, but until the animals actually show you that they can tell the difference, then you don't really know if it's biologically meaningful. So to collect this data, I worked in Samburu and Buffalo Springs National Reserves in northern Kenya, and I also collaborated with Joyce Poole, who worked for many years in Amboseli National Park in southern Kenya. So she provided me with historical data that she had collected years ago. And for all of these calls that I recorded, I attempted to figure out who the caller was, who the receiver was, and what the behavioral context of the call was. And we weren't always able to figure out who a call was addressed to, but sometimes we were able to figure that out from behavioral cues. So for example, if one individual was lagging behind the rest of the group and everybody else was with the main body of the group in that family, and then someone in the main body of the group made a long distance contact call, we could be reasonably certain she was calling to the one individual who was lagging. So in those sort of situations, we could figure out who the call was addressed to. And total, combining the calls from Samburu and Amboseli, we were able to collect 469 contact reading and caregiving rumbles with a known receiver. So to address objective 1, do elephant calls contain information that's specific to the intended receiver? We ran a random forest model, which is a type of machine learning model that can be used to classify observations into predetermined categories. So in this case, the categories we were trying to classify was the identity of the receiver of the call. So we were trying to see if the calls contain any acoustic variation that allows the model to learn who the call was addressed to. So we fed the model calls where each call was labeled according to who the receiver was, and we had 79 acoustic features that described the sound patterns of the call. And then we trained the model on some of the data, tested it on the remaining data, and did this iteratively until it was trained and tested on the full data set to see if the model could learn to predict who a call was addressed to just from the sound patterns of that call. And then to see if the there we go. To see if the model was performing better than chance, we ran the same model again with the acoustic features randomly scrambled so that they were meaningless. So basically see how well does the model perform when it's trained on meaningless data. And we did this 10,000 times to generate a null distribution of classification accuracies of how many calls the model predicted correctly when it was fed meaningless data. And then we compared the accuracy of the original model to this distribution of accuracies under the null model that was just using randomized data. And what we found is that over here on the left, this black histogram, these are the classification accuracies of the null model that was fed meaningless data. This is the distribution of when we ran the model 10,000 times with randomized data. And over here, all the way on the right, is the classification accuracy of the original model. So the original model correctly predicted the receiver for 27.5% of the calls, which, as you can see, is way, way higher than we got even in 10,000 runs with randomized data. It never came even close to that. So that means that the model is predicting the receiver with statistically significantly better accuracy than what it would have been able to achieve with meaningless data. So this doesn't necessarily mean by itself that elephants have names. It's possible the model was using some simpler heuristic to figure out who the receiver was in some of these cases. So for example, in our data set, certain callers were much more likely to call to certain receivers because elephants are much more likely to communicate with members of their own family. So, and we also know that elephant calls are individually specific, like different elephants have unique voices. So it's theoretically possible that the model might have just been picking up on the unique voice patterns of the caller and then using that to predict who the call was most likely to be addressed to based on who that caller tended to call to most often. It's also possible that rather than being specific to individual receivers, maybe calls contain information about the type of relationship between the caller and the receiver. So for example, we know from studies of captive elephants that elephant calls tend to reflect the emotional state of the caller. And when elephants are calling to an individual who they're a little bit afraid of, that's reflected in their voice. So maybe the model was picking up on cues like that and using that to guess who the receiver was most likely to be. So we had to rule out these possibilities before we could conclude that these calls are actually specific to individual receivers like names. So to do that, we extracted something from the random forest model called proximity scores. And basically, a random forest is a collection of decision trees, and each tree uses a fraction of the data. And then it classifies the calls into terminal nodes. It goes down the tree, splitting the data based on decision rules, and then eventually it classifies each of the calls into bins. And the proximity score is a metric of similarity between any two possible calls in the data set. And essentially the way it's calculated is that it's the percentage of trees in the random forest where the two calls in question ended up getting classified into the same bin, adjusted for the size of the different bins. So for example, in this diagram, if we've got 4 trees and the calls A and D were each classified in the same terminal node in 3 out of these 4 trees, then the nodes were all the same size, then the proximity score would be 0.75. So this is basically a measure of similarity between all of the calls, each pair of calls in the data set. So if the calls are just specific to the caller and not to the receiver, or if they're specific to the type of relationship between the caller and the receiver rather than to individual receivers, then 2 calls from the same caller to the same receiver should be no more similar than 2 calls from the same caller to 2 different receivers who have the same type of relationship to the caller. So in this schematic here, receiver 1 and receiver 2 have the same type of relationship to caller A. So these 2 pairs of calls, the one on the left and the one on the right, should have equal proximity scores, or they should have more or less equal proximity scores. But that's not what we found. We found that calls from the same caller to the same individual receiver were significantly more similar on average than calls from the same caller to 2 different receivers, even when those 2 different receivers had the same type of relationship to the caller. So that suggests that these calls are genuinely specific to individual receivers, not merely reflecting the caller's voice patterns and not merely reflecting the type of relationship between the caller and the receiver. So that brings me to objective number 2. When do elephants use names? And to address that, I ran a logistic regression, which basically was modeling the probability that the random forest would correctly predict the receiver of a call as a function of the age of the caller and also the behavioral context of the call. Can you guys see it, when you guys see my screen, does it look normal or is it flickering? Because my screen has started flickering, but it looks good to you guys. Okay, cool. I'll just continue then and hopefully my screen won't die. So basically we found that adult calls made by an adult were significantly more likely to have the receiver predicted correctly by the random forest than calls made by a juvenile. And also, calls that were in the context of contact calling and caregiving rumbles were much more likely to be correctly classified than greeting rumbles. And that's interesting because it suggests that elephants are using names more in the context of contact calling and caregiving than in the context of greeting. And that's it makes sense that they would use names the most in contact calling scenarios, because those are scenarios where the caller and the receiver are out of sight of each other. But why would they be using names more in caregiving rumbles than in greeting rumbles? And it's possible that they're more likely to use names. This is just a hypothesis, but it's possible that they're more likely to use names when they're addressing calves at close distance than when addressing adults at close distance, because this is how the calves learn their names. So it sort of suggests additional avenues for future research about trying to figure out how these names develop. And the fact that adults are more likely to use names than calves, and adults are more likely to use names in a close calling context when they're addressing a calf than when they're addressing an adult, suggests that this behavior may be something that needs to be learned and takes a while to develop. So objective 3 was to try to figure out if different callers use the same name for a given receiver. And we got somewhat conflicting results for this, depending on which analysis we looked at. So prediction 1 for if different callers use the same name to address the same receiver, then a random forest that's trained with calls from one set of callers should be able to predict the receiver for calls made by other callers. In other words, the cues that the model is using to identify the recipient of a call should generalize across different callers. And secondly, if different callers are using the same name to address the same receiver, then calls from different callers to the same receiver should be more similar on average than calls from different callers to different receivers. So as I mentioned, we found kind of conflicting results here. So on the one hand, the random forest model was not able to correctly predict the receiver based on cues that generalized across callers. When we trained it on one set of callers and then asked it to predict the receiver for calls made by other callers, it was not able to perform any better than chance. But we found that calls from different callers to the same receiver were significantly more similar on average than calls made by different callers to different receivers. So that suggests that different callers are using somewhat similar names for the same receiver, but they're not identical. Now, does that mean that they're using the same name for the same receiver? It's not clear because we don't know exactly what features the random forest was picking up on. Maybe the random forest just had difficulty figuring out that the same name as pronounced by different callers in different voices was actually the same name. Or perhaps different elephants use distinct but still somewhat similar names to address the same receiver. Kind of like a loose analogy in human terms might be if a woman is named Elizabeth, and maybe her mother calls her Elizabeth, her sister calls her Ellie, and her friends call her Liz. So she's got like these 3 different nicknames that all share some acoustic features in common, but they're not exactly the same name. So right now we don't really know which of these scenarios is more likely for elephants. The fourth objective was to figure out if elephant names are imitations of the receiver's calls or if they're arbitrary, like human names. So to assess this, we first classified each call in the data set as either convergent with or divergent from the receiver's calls based on how similar it was to the calls produced by the receiver. So convergent calls were more similar to the receiver's calls than typical for that caller, and divergent calls were less similar to the receiver's calls than typical for that caller. And if elephants are addressing receivers by imitating the receiver's own calls, then the random forest should only be able to predict who a call was addressed to for convergent calls, but not for divergent calls. But we found that this was not the case. The random forest performed much better than significantly better than chance for both convergent calls and divergent calls, suggesting that names in elephants are not dependent on imitation of the receiver's calls. Now, this result should be taken with a grain of salt because we didn't exhaustively sample the vocal repertoire for every receiver. So to be absolutely confident that elephants are not imitating the receiver, we would need to have a much larger sample of calls from each receiver. But at least based on the data we have so far, there's no evidence that elephants are relying on imitation to address one another. And finally, that brings me to the last objective, which is to figure out, okay, so we've got all this data from machine learning that suggests that elephant calls contain names or something like a name, but is this actually biologically meaningful? Do the elephants actually respond to this? So to do that, we did a playback experiment where we played back 2 different contact rumbles each to 17 different elephants. So each elephant received a call that was originally addressed to her and another call that was produced by the same caller but originally addressed to someone else. And the idea was that if these calls are specific to the individual receiver and elephants can perceive this, they should respond more strongly by reacting more quickly and calling more in response to a call that was originally addressed to them compared to a call from the same caller that was originally addressed to someone else. And it was important to have both these calls come from the same caller, so that way we controlled for the caller's relationship to the receiver. So my screen is flickering too much for me to actually see the play button on the video, but I'm going to try to play this by hitting the space bar and see if that works. So this was a playback that we did to an elephant named Margaret, and that was one of the 2 playbacks. It was either a call that was so I guess so this one was a call that was originally addressed to her, and then I'll play you the call that was originally addressed to someone else but made by the same caller. So hopefully you were able to see there that Margaret reacted to the first call, the one that was originally addressed to her, by calling back immediately. Whereas in response to the second call that was originally addressed to someone else, she lifted her head and looked around, but she never called in response. And I cut that video off for the sake of brevity, but we continued filming her for more than 10 minutes, and she never called in response. So on average, we found that subjects approached the speaker significantly more quickly in test playbacks, that is, in playbacks of calls that were originally addressed to them. They also vocalized more quickly in response to test playbacks. And finally, they produced more calls on average in response to test playbacks. So across these 3 metrics, elephants reacted more strongly to calls that were originally addressed to them compared to calls that were originally addressed to someone else. So that supports the hypothesis that elephants can tell just by hearing a call whether it was intended for them or whether it was intended for someone else. So just to wrap up, we found that calls are specific to individual receivers. Names, or something like a name, seem to be more likely to occur in contact and caregiving calls than in greeting calls. Different callers use somewhat similar but not identical names for the same receiver. And there's no evidence, at least at present, that elephants rely on imitation of the receiver's calls in order to address the receiver. And finally, receivers can determine whether a call was addressed to them just by hearing the call out of context. So with that, I'd like to thank all of my co-authors, especially my funding source, the National Science Foundation, and my collaborators in Kenya and the national and local Kenyan governments. And if you have any questions, we can proceed with that.
Thank you so much for that illuminating talk, Mickey. This recent discovery by you and your colleagues has been at least all over my newsfeed lately, and it's been really exciting to have you unpack some of the details behind this study with us here today. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure the audience has plenty to talk about. So we'll just open up the floor to comments and questions now. So just another reminder that you can post questions in the chat by selecting the chat icon at the bottom of the screen and then typing in your question. or by raising your hand to speak on the call by selecting the react icon and then the raise hand function, so I know who to call upon. And also, if you'd like, please feel free to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background before making your remarks. Serge, you want to go ahead, or oh, I saw your hand up for a moment, but yeah, Diana, do you want to kick things off for us? I think you're
I
muted.
think you're muted, Diana.
I think Jason may have had his hand up first, so let me defer to Jason, and then maybe I had a question too. Go ahead, Jason.
Hey, lovely talk. Sorry, I got a little late in there. I did have a question on your use of the word name. So, my background is signature whistles. We do a lot of work with playbacks and dolphins, and looking at specifically nature of representation in signature whistle. When we initially did some of these early playback studies, we would play signature whistles to the dolphins. The dolphins would respond differentially to the signature whistles. And the best we could get anyone to let us call them was labels. All right. So labels meaning that, we didn't understand that the dolphin had a representational understanding that when it heard a signature whistle, it was essentially picturing that other individual in their head. Mm-hmm. So we were not allowed to use the word names for these kinds of things. With what you're working with here, do you have a sense of the representational understanding of these call structures, especially in the playback sense, that you can use the word name comfortably, or are you thinking more like, okay, well, maybe these are just more or less individually specific calls that are being produced, and the name thing we may have to hold off on a little bit before we have a better sense of kind of what is the representation understanding of these call structures?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first of all, I think I used the word name-like, and that was kind of a compromise between my co-authors and myself. I was a little bit, I wanted to be a little bit more conservative about it. So my co-authors felt that we should not shy away from using the term name, because if we use vocal label, like the average person and maybe even the average behavioral scientist isn't going to understand what that is, because it's a very field-specific jargon, and that names kind of give readers a better sense of what it is that we're talking about. I think that, obviously there's been a lot more work done on signature whistles in dolphins than on these kind of calls in elephants. And I'm certainly not an expert on dolphins, but based on my reading of the literature, I think there's far more evidence that these signature whistles are representational in dolphins than what we've been able to discover so far in elephants. So like, as dolphins recognize signature whistles cross-modally. So they associate an individual's signature whistle with urine from that individual. So they associate, the like auditory and olfactory modalities together, and maybe that indicates that they have some kind of mental representation of the individual. I feel like if we're going to call these calls in elephants names, we should certainly apply the same terminology to dolphins. And I think that maybe after publishing the paper, I've kind of wondered if we made a bit of a mistake in making it seem like we were saying that these calls in elephants were somehow more complex than what we see in dolphins. I don't think that's the case. I think they're different, in that I don't think that I don't think there's any evidence that elephants have a signature call that's primarily associated with that individual. And so I think the mechanisms are a little different than what happens in dolphins, but I don't think it's any less complex or any more or less of a true name, if that answers your question.
Awesome. Thank you. Diana, do you want to
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for that really fascinating talk. And I had a follow-up question, getting into the actual, what you might think about some specific features that might be in those calls when you look across calls. I don't know whether you looked at that. I found it really lovely that you were thinking about the relationship maybe being signified somehow, as well as the individual. And I wonder whether it couldn't be a combination of things. Maybe there's something about role relationships that are not just the obvious role relationships that we might think of as humans. It's always, we get stuck in our little boxes about what we're looking for, but maybe there is something about relationships between those different animals that may be encoded. So I was wondering, did you find anything that was invariant across when you looked at the structure of the features that were analyzed from receiver B and C when they were calling to A?
No, but I'm not sure that we structured the analysis to identify that if there were such features. So we kind of ended up this. I didn't talk about how we selected the acoustic features, but we ended up choosing to use acoustic features that were more esoteric and more difficult to understand as a trade-off between interpretability and capturing as much of the acoustic variation in the calls as we could. So the acoustic features we ended up using are very difficult to interpret intuitively, and it's difficult to understand how these features relate to the acoustic properties of the call. So we did try to look at the variable importance scores of the random forest to see which features came out as most important, but I'm not confident that those actually tell us anything about exactly how the names are encoded, because it's very difficult to relate them back to the acoustic features of the call. And in terms of trying to figure out if there were features that were invariant across different callers addressing the same receiver, again, it wasn't really something we were able to look at with the acoustic feature set we had, because I think that what we were capturing with the features is sort of a conglomerate of acoustic features that together allow the random forest to identify the names with some degree of accuracy, but it's not like we're capturing exactly how the names are encoded in those calls. So I think what I really like to do in the future is, so there's a preprint that was recently published showing that the formants in elephant rumbles vary over the course of the call. Essentially, like they have different vowels or vowel-like structures that change over the course of the call. And that is something that really hasn't been shown before. So if this sort of stands up to peer review, I'd really like to look at that, because I think that there's some potential for combinatorial encoding. And if we could figure out how that works, then we might be able to identify like exactly how the names are encoded in the calls. And then we could definitively answer questions of like, do different callers use the same name for the same receiver or not? But first we have to figure out what acoustic features are the elephants actually using to perceive different calls as different names or labels for other individuals.
Thank you. Could I just squeeze one? Oh, I'll pass for somebody else. I had one other question, but I'll hold off on that one. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, we can circle back to you, Diana. I'm going to address, we have a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to address a couple of them before we get to Kelly and Ofer. So Julia asks, I am unsure, however, about the logic of the argument that dolphin signature whistles are non-arbitrary. It's not like they're imitating the sound of the dolphin moving through the water. They're imitating the sound of a vocalization. And she asked, how is that different from a name or a word? It seems arbitrary to me and very much like a name. And there's some discussion with Jason. I think it connects to his remarks as well. But
yeah, that's also a really good question. And it's something that we also went back and forth on a little bit. So I think that when it's a little bit of a philosophical issue. And I think it depends on in what context you think about the dolphin signature whistles. So when thinking about it from the perspective of the individual who develops the whistle, like they learn to produce their own whistle by pulling together elements from other whistles they hear around them. I think that very much is an arbitrary signal. So when an individual produces their own signature whistle, to announce their own identity, it's clearly arbitrary. There's nothing inherent about their whistle that's connected to their physical properties. But given that most of the time dolphins are producing their own whistle, and when it's actually used to address somebody else in the same way that we call someone by name, you could argue that when somebody else is addressing a dolphin by imitating that other dolphin's signature whistle, it's hard to know whether the dolphin who's copying the whistle is thinking of the whistle as a sort of arbitrary symbol that represents their friend or family member, or whether they're imitating a sound that they associate the most with that individual. And again, this is like somewhat of a semantic issue, because in humans, we also produce our own names to introduce ourselves, and then others imitate those names to call us. But I think that there is a difference in that in humans, our names are more often produced by others addressing us than we ourselves produce them to introduce ourselves. So it's not, and the name is also not the most common sound that we make, or a sound that's almost exclusively associated with us. Whereas in dolphins, more often than not, the signature whistle is produced by the owner of the whistle. So you can make an argument that when other individuals copy that whistle to introduce the owner of the whistle, they're copying the sound that is most typically associated with the maker of that sound. Again, it's a little bit of a semantic argument, and I think you could definitely make a valid argument that these are arbitrary signals in dolphins. But I think because they're imitating a sound that is very often produced by the individual who that sound refers to, it's not 100% clear from the perspective of the copier this is really an arbitrary signal, if that makes any sense.
Great. There's another question here from Karim, who's curious about how you recorded the sub 1 kilohertz calls, and recorded at 198 kilohertz. And they're curious if you have a mic recommendation, if that's not a trade secret.
Yeah, so we did not record at 198 kilohertz. We recorded, the sampling rate we used was 44.1 kilohertz, which is more than enough to get elephant calls, because they're typically rumbles are typically between like 10 hertz and maybe 1 kilohertz. So the microphone we used was a QTC40 microphone from Earthworks, and I think it has a frequency response that's more or less flat from like 3 hertz to 2000 hertz, or not 2000, no, it's like 40, yeah, 3 hertz to like 40,000 hertz is the frequency response. So it's about $1,000. It's like commercially available. You can get it from Earthworks. Yeah.
And Mandy asks, did you notice any differences between the populations in Samburu versus M. boselli? And if so, do you think that this is the case? Or why do you think that this is the case? Sorry.
So that was actually the subject of a second paper that we wrote, which just got accepted recently but hasn't come out yet. So we found, yes, there are differences between Samburu and M. boselli. Specifically, Samburu rumbles were on average higher in frequency than M. boselli rumbles after controlling for age and behavioral context. Why is that the case? We don't know, but we think the most likely explanation is probably something like cultural drift due to learning. We don't know for sure that elephants learn rumbles, but we know they're capable of learning sounds. So it seems likely that learning plays a role in the development of rumbles. And obviously, when animals learn their vocalizations, this tends to lead to divergence among time, especially when populations are isolated from each other. So that could explain why the Samburu and M. boselli populations are slightly different in the structure of their rumbles. There are also potential other explanations too. It's not necessarily learning, but that is one possibility.
Great. Kelly, do you want to? I know you've been waiting patiently. I think you have your microphone muted.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, cool. So hi, I also have a background in dolphin cognition and communication and all of that. So the first thing I want to do is sort of go back to something you just said to make sure I'm understanding you right about dolphins. And then I have a question about the elephants. One, with dolphins, on the one hand, you said that when one dolphin is making another signature whistle, and I've always hated the idea that we call those imitations, because there is no other way of making the sound, like you said, than if I produce your name, in some sense, I've imitated that. And on the one hand, you say, well, it could just be they're matching sounds without understanding a symbolic relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
That only worked before Jason's urine study, right? Because with Jason's urine study, which you talked about, we know that they have some sort of symbolic understanding of that, at least to the extent that they can cross-modally match. So with that in mind, doesn't that mean that it's not, quote, just mimicking?
Well, so I think there's a distinction that can be made between something being symbolic and something being arbitrary versus iconic. So I think you can absolutely have iconic symbols. I think it seems quite likely that the dolphins do understand that these signature whistles are a symbol, or at the very least that they can recognize that the signature whistle is connected to the olfactory properties of the individual that it refers to. But we also have iconic words in human language, like onomatopoeia, for example. We understand that the word bang is a symbol that refers to loud, harsh noises. We don't think that the word, when somebody says the word bang, that it literally is a loud bang, right? We understand that it's a symbol, and yet there's still this iconic connection between that. So I don't know. Like I said, it may have been a mistake to try to make this distinction between arbitrary and iconic labeling in elephants or dolphins, because I'm not entirely sure that is really a meaningful distinction when it comes to names. But when we were thinking about it, like, our thinking was that in dolphins, it may be easier for them to learn the name because they hear the other individual making it all the time, right? Whereas in elephants, and again, like, our finding that these names are not imitative is preliminary because we didn't exhaustively sample the vocal repertoires of the receivers. But if that holds up, if it really is not an imitation of the receiver's calls, then that means that those calls have to be either made up, or either they hear it from somebody else rarely and learn it based on much less input, or the caller has to make it up de novo, and then the receiver has to learn to respond to it. And so it seems to me that it is a little bit of a different process. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's more or less complex. It's just different. But that was kind of the point we were trying to get across. Like, it's not necessarily a more name-like than dolphin calls. It's just a different system from what it looks like so far.
Cool. Now my question about elephants, and let me preface this by saying I think this is some of the coolest discussions in the world, and I think it's very important that when we're looking, that we look across, large brain social animals to try to figure out, well, how do they contact each other, and what does count as a name, etc. That said, when I think of name, the part I'm struggling with is two parts. When I think of name, I think of a label that different individuals can use to get my attention, right? To refer to me. And so I'm a little bit concerned by the fact, and not sure what to do with the fact that you didn't find, like, when you look at a dolphin signature whistle, you can say, oh, this is the whistle that is for Delphi, and other dolphins can all make that. And my understanding is that's not what you found, right?
Right.
They within one caller, they had different name structures for different individuals. I also then wonder, though, if you made a point of saying that it's not just relationship, right? And if I remember right from reading your paper, the way that you defined relationship was age, class, and relatedness, right? But of course, relationships are so much more than that, right? And so if I'm talking to, if I'm saying hi or calling to my spouse versus my boss versus my best friend versus a virtual stranger, there may be differences that you can find in that acoustic structure. And so I'm wondering if there's a way to disentangle those.
Yeah, it's a tough problem because we don't know how elephants define their own relationships. We do know that the strongest relationships in elephants are between a mother and her daughter. We do know that allo-mother relationships are important as well, and that is determined primarily by age and whether they're members of the same group. So we defined our relationship categories based on what we know about relationships in elephants, but it is still essentially an arbitrary distinction, and it's possible that we didn't define the relationship categories in the way that was most biologically relevant. So we can't completely rule out the possibility that these calls are really just specific to relationship types, but we didn't correctly bin the relationships into the right categories to capture that. So with regard to different callers using the same label for the same receiver, that was also a very vexing problem because we got different results of different analyses. So I think my hypothesis, like sort of my intuition about what seems like the most likely explanation, is that I suspect it may be that we just didn't have enough calls from different callers addressing the same receiver for the random forest to be able to learn patterns that generalized across different callers. Our data set was very imbalanced, and that was the biggest shortcoming of this study, that we didn't reliably have like lots of different calls from different callers addressing the same receiver. So there's this confound between caller identity and receiver identity, and that's why we use the proximity scores to ensure that that wasn't explaining all the results we found. So I think we can be pretty confident that these calls are specific to receivers or something about the receiver, and it's not just a product of the caller's voice patterns. But in terms of whether different callers address the same receiver, I think it may just be that the random forest didn't have enough data from different callers, because we found that different callers addressing the same receiver were more similar on average than when they were addressing different receivers. So at the very least, there's some convergence among different callers addressing the same receiver. That doesn't necessarily mean they're using the same name, but it also suggests they're not using completely disparate names for the same individual. And I think what we really need to do next in this system is to try to figure out, like you said, like we have to be able to identify the labels for specific individuals. And if we can do that, then we can answer all these other questions about, are these really specific to relationships? Are they the same name used by different callers, but just, sound different because of the caller's voice or something like that?
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Ofer, do you want to take the floor?
Sure. Do you hear me? Okay, this is really interesting, but I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One of them is that the more I use machine learning classifiers, the more I'm impressed by how amazing they are, and also the more paranoid I become. The inference bias is really, really strong. They'll practically give you almost anything you want if there's a shred of something they can catch on there. I'm pretty sure that what you have is real, and I also want to join what other people said earlier, that maybe you are leaning too much on the names and not enough on other interpretation. One thing that worries me with all those things, that even if it was, think about, for example, environmental noise. I mean, you can't get rid of them. And for example, if you tend to be always behind an individual and turn to that individual, the environmental noise will change. So there are many, many ways in which your data can point you to the wrong direction. I'll give you one advice, which is what I did all the time in my career. I always listen. Now, I know that those sounds that you have are not easy to listen to, but it's very easy to transpose them to your hearing range. And one of my secrets as I was young is that I spent hours listening. Always listen and listen and listen. And if those are, and the other advice I want to give you, if you want to take it, is that be careful with your p-values, especially when you use those random trees from the forest, because first of all, I can give you a lot of technical issues about what's the meaning of those p-values and what it doesn't mean when you're combining them with what you're doing. But I would say that looking at variance and effect size would help a lot. You know, the interpretation of name is very symbolic. And the data that you showed don't look very symbolic. A lot of it reminds me of the kind of thing that Michael Overen used to say about monkeys' vocalization, about like that the interpretation of big brain and cognitive and like us can be a bit overwhelming. So here again, my kind of feeling is that the variation that you'll see will be maybe more meaningful when you try to interpret if it's really more like a name or more kind, you know, like communicating with different animals, like motherese and stuff like that. Or it can be a combination of stuff. And I think that the more you listen and the more you use your intuition, the more likely you are. I mean, again, don't believe too strongly in those analyses and models. They are sometimes too strong to be true. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, thanks. I think that I definitely understand what you're saying about machine learning can identify patterns that aren't really biologically meaningful. And I think that's why the playback experiment was so critical for this. What I would really like to do, you know, as much as everybody is excited about machine learning, and I'm excited about it too, but I think it does have the main drawback that it has is lack of interpretability. And so what I would really like to do in the future, as I mentioned earlier, is to try to figure out exactly how this information is encoded in the calls. And my hypothesis right now is that it may have something to do with this pattern of the formants changing over time in the rumbles. And if we can identify that, if it turns out to be a sort of combinatorial system, which at this point is completely hypothetical, but if it does, then we might actually be able to assess more directly whether these are sort of discrete symbolic units, like you said, or whether it's a more graded system that has more to do with, you know, relationship or something like that.
Fascinating. Thank you. Marianne.
Well, first, I'd like to thank everyone. This is fascinating. I've been in the field studying interspecies communication since the 70s, trying to buck the scientific paradigm about a bit, doing initial studies of brain cognition and brainwaves showing that when we become passive participants, we get better observations than when we're active observers. So that was back in the 70s. Didn't go over big back then, but since then, and studying more in consciousness and looking at what is the meaning behind the sounds that are made, as vocalizations are one way to communicate. My primary species has been wild and feral horses. And what's been interesting is that we can separate herds and mix them up, but the call can be very to their conspecifics, meaning it may not be an individual, but a horse will call, the other horses ignore it, but the horses that recognize that individual will call back. And the way you categorize them, I think, is pretty consistent, being a distance call. That's when they're going to send communication as to where are you? Do you have food? Do you have water? Has something happened? So we look at the information and then the reaction of that call. Did it initiate behavior in the conspecifics of the herd or not? And when you see a horse leave a group and try to jump a fence to get to their friend who's calling somewhere, that would be perceived as a response. What we also found is that oftentimes you would see various herd cultures where some horses were very vocal and used a lot more vocalization than another group, which were very quiet. And I think, you know, being a behavioral ecologist and looking at functional social bonds in horses, I'd have to say that it probably does have something to do with habitat, that those that needed to be quieter and maybe use smell and visual and different ways to communicate didn't need to develop a vocal skill set. whereas those that were out on the plains and maybe had mountains in between and valleys, they tended to oftentimes use vocalization more. So my question, getting to the work you did with elephants, and I see Cynthia Moss was also listed on one of your papers too, is since vocalization is only one way that they're calling each other, communicating, did you get any reference for information that might be transferred in the calls? Like, what's the importance of the call? To find out where the conspecifics are, to just check in, to give assurance? In other words, what was the information transferred, in your opinion?
So it wasn't something that we looked at specifically in this study. Other studies that have looked at elephant calls have primarily focused on what you might call like non-semantic information, like things about the caller's internal state and identity. So we know the rumbles convey information about the caller's individual identity, age, sex, emotional state, and reproductive status. And I'm certain that they also convey some information about context, because they're quite variable across contexts, and there has been some work showing that rumbles produced in different contexts are at least statistically distinguishable from one another, if not discretely identifiable. And in some cases they do seem to be discretely identifiable even. So we're pretty sure that these rumbles convey some information about the context, but exactly what that information is hasn't really been assessed very much. There's been a couple studies on rumbles made in response to threats that seem to show that they differ in response to different threats, like humans versus bees. There's a particular type of rumble that elephants tend to make when they're initiating group movement. And so like one individual will make these let's go rumbles that have a very characteristic visual posture associated with them, and also tend to be very like relatively long rumbles that have a flat frequency contour. And then after they make that, there's sort of like a back and forth antiphonal rumbling between about 3 individuals, where they also make these sort of long flat rumbles. So those types of rumbles seem to be associated with group departures, but exactly what information is being conveyed there, we don't know. So yeah, I guess I don't have a very satisfying answer for that, but bottom line is we think there is a lot of interesting information in those calls, but we don't know exactly what.
Thanks, Marianne, for elaborating on those questions you posed earlier in the chat. Sorry, I missed them. Okay, yeah, there's a lot going on in the chat, so I'm going to read a couple of those before getting to you, Diana. User C Willett asks, regarding the third objective, could the names differ for different callers because of the emotional content that might accompany a call? Are names even used potentially to correct and even ironically to communicate a negative emotion or rejection, say, of a caregiver for the calf?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the calls conveying emotional information, we know from studies of captive elephants that is the case, that in different situations where you would expect the elephants to have different emotional states, the calls do vary in predictable ways. So it's certainly possible that the emotional content or the emotional valence of a particular relationship between the caller and the receiver affects the structure of the call, and therefore that affects the model's ability to generalize these labels across callers. In terms of the second part of your question, I think that's entirely speculative at this point. We don't really have any data that would indicate, one way or another whether elephants are using, are correcting negative emotions or anything like that. But I think in terms of the emotional content affecting why different calls addressed to the same receiver seem to be different. Yeah, it's like these calls are very complex in terms of the information that they pack into them. And because we didn't know exactly what acoustic features were relevant to these putative names, we just measured, the variation across the entire spectrum of the call. So we were capturing a lot of variation that probably wasn't relevant. So there's a lot of noise in this data, and I think that's probably why the results aren't as clear as we might like.
Okay. Yeah, Helen asks, let's see, she'd love to ask about your future plans for looking at this kind of research in other groups. Her PhD research is in male elephant social behavior. And she was wondering if you would expect to find something similar in the males. She says, I'm sure they have similar capabilities in general, but with much weaker relationships and a higher turnover of social partners. How many different names do you think they can recognize? Also, if they can recognize names of other elephants and smells, sights of zookeepers, do you think it's possible that captive elephants could have names for individual keepers?
Ooh, good questions. So number one, in our study, we did not include calls from adult males at all. And part of the reason for that is that we barely recorded any. So almost all of the calls that I recorded from adult males were must rumbles. For those people who are not, familiar with elephants, must rumbles are these rumbles that male African elephants make when they're in must, which is a heightened aggressive and sexual state that they go through every year once they reach maturity. They're very distinctive calls. They're only produced by males in must, and those are pretty much the only calls that I was able to record from male elephants, mostly because I wasn't spending that much time with adult male elephants. So we just didn't have enough calls to look at them at all. We did find that there were, quite a number of calls that were very consistently predicted correctly by the random forest that were addressed to juvenile males. So that suggests that elephants probably are, adult female elephants probably are labeling juvenile males. So if juvenile males have a name, you might think that maybe they would carry it through to adulthood. But I don't have any data on whether that's the case or not. I think that it certainly seems possible that they do. I know that Caitlin O'Connell's group has done some recent work on rumbles in male elephants, showing that they also produce let's go rumbles, for example. So they are more vocal than sometimes they seem, as I'm sure you know, but I haven't done much work with adult males myself. And again, as far as whether it's possible that captive elephants could have names for individual keepers, sure, I think it's possible. I don't think we have any evidence for or against it at this point. But if elephants are inventing names for other elephants, and if they form relationships with individual keepers in captivity, then it seems certainly within the realm of possibility that they might develop names for keepers. But again, it's just speculation. I don't have any data on that one way or the other.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, Francine thanks you for your work in presentation and asks, is there evidence that these names are used continuously throughout the lifetime of the elephants? Do you have plans to determine when the calves begin to use their own name to give to receivers other than their mothers, to assess when the names become aligned with their identity? Also, is there a similar developmental trajectory in elephant cognitive development when this might happen? From my research, there's almost no research on this in humans.
Yeah, so great questions. Unfortunately, I don't really have an answer to them. This study only took place over the course of 4 years, so we don't really have, well, we do have the calls from Ambicelli, so we have at least some longitudinal data there, but it's not really enough to say anything about the stability of these names over time, not least of which because we still haven't been able to isolate the names of specific individuals. I think that's sort of the bottleneck step before we can answer a lot of these questions that we'd all like to know the answers to. What we were able to find is that the random forest model was much, much better at identifying the receiver for calls that were made by adults. So that suggests, but doesn't conclusively demonstrate, that adults are more likely to call others by name than calves are, which, if that's the case, would imply that perhaps it takes a while for elephants to learn the names for other individuals. Also, anecdotally, so another thing we found is that the random forest was much better at predicting the receiver for caregiving rumbles than for close distance calls between adults, which suggests that adults may be particularly likely to use names or these name-like calls when addressing calves at close distance than when addressing adults at close distance. And that has led me to speculate that maybe calves learn their names from their mothers and their allo mothers. So very anecdotally, we have had the opportunity to observe several elephants shortly after they gave birth. And after an elephant gives birth, she typically makes these caregiving rumbles over and over and over again to the calf, repeated pretty frequently, much more so than when the calf is a little bit older. And that makes me wonder if perhaps like this is how the calves learn their names. Like maybe the mother comes up with a name for the calf, repeats it over and over and over again, and then the calf learns it that way. So again, speculative, but it's a possibility. So I think looking into the ontogeny of these name-like calls and how they develop over time is definitely something that I'd really like to do. But it's going to require a lot more study because we haven't been studying this long enough to have any kind of real longitudinal data on it.
Yeah, and Francine kind of follows up with a similar question, I think, that maybe you can only speculate about, but she asks again, is there a relationship amongst the names that mothers give to all of their calves? How are the names chosen? Do they have a matrilineal relationship that identifies them to their family or their clan?
Yeah, again, in order to answer that question, we're going to need to do more work to figure out how the names are encoded in the calls. So that's the next step. But yeah, until we figure that out, we can't answer that, unfortunately.
Okay, Mandy asks, I'm curious to learn more about your journey studying communication in birds and then elephants and then back to birds. And what were some surprising similarities that you found between your study species?
So it's an interesting question. So I actually started my PhD and I wanted to study elephants. So I started working with Asian elephants and I discovered that they are a remarkably difficult species to work with. They were much less vocal than the African elephants. They're much harder to see because the habitat was much denser. So I ended up leaving that project, and then I ended up studying acorn woodpeckers because that's what my PhD advisor worked on. So it wasn't my initial plan to work with birds, and I ended up working with them kind of just because I needed a PhD project. The elephant thing hadn't worked out, and in terms of like surprising similarities, I don't know how surprising it is, but I think sometimes people get very caught up in like the cognition of these species that I call like the canonically smart animals. So that would be like non-human primates, cetaceans, elephants, corvids, and parrots, right? And those are like the animals everyone's like, oh yeah, those animals are very smart. And a lot of interest in animal cognition is focused on those taxa. But I think a lot of people don't realize that there's actually quite a lot of really fascinating and surprisingly complex cognition in other species. So like woodpeckers, for example, are not typically thought of as a canonically smart species. But what I found in my PhD work is that not only do they vocally recognize other individuals, which is quite widespread among birds and mammals, but they remember, they can recognize members of their own group who have left the group and are now living on another territory, which means either they remember them for years or they maintain contact with them after they've left their natal territory. And not only that, but they also understand something about the relationships between birds that live in other groups. So these woodpeckers are territorial. They have their own family groups, and it's actually quite a complex social structure, but they spend a lot of time visiting other territories looking for breeding opportunities. Because of the way that breeding opportunities happen in this species, it's quite complex and there's a lot of competition involved. So they spend a lot of time spying on their neighbors, and it turns out that they know which neighbors belong together. So they know like whether two individual neighbors belong to the same group as each other or whether they belong to two different neighboring groups. And so it suggests that their social knowledge extends far beyond their own social unit. They actually have quite a complex understanding of the relationships between the individuals in their whole neighborhood. And it's not to say that acorn woodpeckers are particularly unique either. I think this sort of complex social cognition is actually a lot more widespread than people necessarily realize.
Okay, Elena asks, she says, I realize this question may be impossible to answer, but is it possible that elephants or other animals in these kinds of studies behave or speak differently when they know that humans are watching?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. You know, as animal behaviorists, we always kind of hope that that's not the case, that when we're observing the animals, that our presence doesn't affect their behavior and therefore skew our results. So these elephants at this site are habituated to humans. They're quite, or at least if you're in a vehicle, they kind of treat you like just a feature in the environment. If you get out on foot, then they start to get upset because usually when people shoot them, those people are on foot. So they're pretty habituated to us in the vehicle, and we hope that that means that they're not really changing their behavior around us very much. I know that when I worked in Sri Lanka, the person who founded that project, Sherman De Silva, told me that when she first started the project, the Asian elephants at that site were a lot more vocal than they were when I was there, and she attributed that to them being disturbed by the presence of humans following them. And so they were producing a lot of vocalizations that were associated with alarm or agitation. And that potentially, you know, would be an example of human presence altering the way that the animals communicate. But yeah, I don't think that was the case with the elephants that I was studying, because you know we know certain vocalizations in elephants are associated with alarm, and it didn't seem like they were producing a lot of those vocalizations. But yeah, it's always a possibility that we try to minimize as much as we can.
Great. Well, I have a question. It's less of a technical question really about the study, but you know, as I've been exploring your work online, I've noticed that, you know, alongside your academic research and outreach, you're also a vocal advocate for the autonomy and moral worth of other animals. And so I've seen you, you know, sort of partake in various animal welfare and conservation related efforts like activism or consultancy, writing op-eds or making content for social media. You know, touching on topics like animal liberation and captivity, government subsidization of factory farming, the personal and socioeconomic impacts of a vegan diet, and things like this. So, and I think that this really, you know, sort of resonates with an interest that's shared here at the Interspecies Internet about how, you know, maybe breakthroughs in the science of animal communication and cognition might shift our perspective towards seeing animals as complex agents in their own right, with moral value that are deserving of our respect and care. And so, yeah, with this in mind, I'm just kind of wondering if you want to speak to the relationship between your scientific work and your advocacy for animal rights and welfare. You know, I don't know, it's pretty sort of broad, but you know, just any
Sure.
that limit that interaction or how you see them complementing each other, or maybe...
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess on the one hand, like I think it's really important as scientists for us to try to like avoid any of our, you know, our personal biases from influencing our work. And we all have personal biases. So like I try very hard to not let my scientific work be influenced by what I hope is the case or what I think might be the case. You know, and obviously I care a great deal about animals as individuals, so I recognize that that may create some, you know, unconscious biases about assuming that maybe they're more intelligent than they are or something. So I try to be very careful about that in my scientific work. As for why I advocate for animal rights, the simple reason is because I feel like the more we learn about the cognitive abilities of other animals, the more and more impossible it is to justify treating them the way that we do. I think that industrial animal agriculture is hands down the greatest atrocity that humans have ever committed. And I think that, as somebody who studies animal cognition and knows something about the cognitive and emotional complexity of other animals, that it would be irresponsible of me to not use that to advocate to end this atrocity. So I think, yeah, I mean, basically, my feeling is that given what we know about non-human animals' sentience, right, there is no logical reason why we should continue to assume that they have less moral worth than humans do. And I know that's a controversial idea, but I've never encountered a sound logical argument for why non-human animals that are sentient should have less moral worth than a human being. And I think that once we accept that premise, accept the premise that our assumption that humans matter more than other species is a form of bias and frankly a form of bigotry in the same way that racism or sexism is, that then what logically follows from that is that we have to radically change the way that we relate to other animals and the way that we treat them. And so that's kind of what I try to affect in my advocacy. When I talk about science, like I try to, regardless of whether it's in an advocacy context or a purely scientific context, I always try my best to make sure that whatever I'm saying is thoroughly backed up by evidence, and I would never distort the data to present a particular advocacy position. But I think the data are quite clear that a lot of the animals that we're treating like commodities should not be treated that way if we're going to have any kind of morally consistent worldview. And so that's what that's why I advocate to try to end that.
Yeah, thank you for that response. Always very interesting to explore the overlap between science and society in this way. But so we have one last question in the chat, again from Marianne. She asked, have you found it more complex communication in social groups who have been together over a longer period of time versus individuals who may not have interacted for as long? Are you seeing communication increase over time, or is it perhaps related to the level of emotional connection between individuals? Do certain individuals tend to talk more than others?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question that I think, again, would require longer longitudinal data to fully answer. So in the Samburu population, we do have kind of an interesting situation that is the result of something really tragic, which is that in 2009, 2010, there was a really serious wave of ivory poaching. So a lot of individuals were killed, and that broke up a lot of families. Some families were almost entirely wiped out, except for a few individuals. So we have these situations where, which is kind of unusual for elephants in their natural state, where unrelated individuals have come together and joined other families. And it would have been really fascinating to record their vocalizations when they first joined the family and then record them now that they're well established to see how that changed over time. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't know much about that right now because there hasn't been this longitudinal study of vocalizations at Samburu. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that we could start doing. Unfortunately, I think we can expect, not that this is something we want, but we can probably expect that there's going to be a lot more human-caused social disturbance to elephants in a lot of different sites. Right now in Samburu, one of the leading causes of mortality for elephants is being shot by people, and it's actually not for ivory poaching. It's not even really for human-elephant conflict, although that's usually how it gets labeled. We don't even know why it's happening. Like a lot of these elephants are just getting shot potentially for target practice or just like as a sort of form of protest against the local authorities, or they're getting caught in the crossfire between like there's a lot of tribal warfare in Samburu, so like people are shooting each other and elephants may get caught in the conflict. It's a really sad situation all around, but because of that disturbance, I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see elephants changing groups in this population. And if we can continue to study them long term, we may actually learn something really informative about how elephants, how elephant vocalizations change when they change social groups, how they learn to interact with members of a new group, and that kind of thing.
Marianne, do you want to follow up on that? Or
I mean, this is the conversation that I could go and listen to for hours and hours, and I'm seeing names pop up. Is there a way that we are going to be able to continue sharing information? I haven't seen Diana Reese in 40 years, I think, and that was a cetacean conference in Monterey. We gave papers, and that was when I was working with the Dolphin Network doing cognitive studies. Joe and Rosie and Lily and all that. And now, you know, we flash forward 40 years, I see there's so many people, and I'm Googling all their references, and what a wealth of knowledge there is here. Is there a way to link us all together, follow up, have more interaction? It's fascinating.
That I'll just jump in here. Hi, Marianne. Great to see you again. That's what the Interspecies Internet is about. We have this community, and I'm so pleased that you're with us and everybody's here today. I think this has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. Not only did we have a great talk, but the questions people are asking, the comments, I mean, it's been a terrific conversation. That's what this is about. So aside from you linking with Mickey further, please continue to join this for these kinds of conversations. I'm thrilled to hear that you're interested.
Cross-pollinate and cross-species, because as you probably know, the horse world is taking a turn after the Olympics. So social license and science versus culture, these are things that are really on the forefront. And being able to use science from cross-species work in psychology has more appeal to changing the global perspective of both the public and equestrians, because a horse is no different than any other social mammal. And so, you know, borrowing things that have already been done, showing the cognition, the sentient, the emotional connection, you know, it's delightful. And in my new book, I put out a lot of cross-species information and had pushback from people saying, what do dolphin communication or elephant communication have anything to do with horses? Which tells me how ignorant the population is on social psychology of mammals. So thank you. Thank you for this. This is fabulous, all of you that put this together.
yeah, and thank you for attending. And yeah, like Diana said, this is, you know, this is the mission and the vision of Interspecies Internet to, you know, be a platform that convenes specialists as well as, you know, general enthusiasts in the public to share knowledge and discussion and work towards shared goals. And yeah, if you'd like to, you know, learn more about our organization or stay up to date with events or projects and other activity, you can connect, you know, with our community on social media or our YouTube channel. You can join our Slack channel to, you know, continue discussions, subscribe to our newsletter. All of those links are in the chat. I think Carol posted them just a moment ago. And yeah, and we'd love to, you know, have your, you know, continued attendance at the Interspecies Conversations lecture series as well. So, yeah, thank you. I think maybe this is all the time that we have today. But thank you so much again, Mickey, for joining us and you know, taking the time to share this incredible and richly informative talk. Thank you to the community for attending and engaging. We hope it's been a very rewarding experience for everyone. And also, if you'd like to stay up to date with Mickey's work, I've posted some links in the chat as well. You need to scroll up a little further to see them, but his personal website and some social media handles and a YouTube channel. Yeah, so once more, on behalf of the Interspecies Internet, the trustees and the community, thank you again for joining us today. Have a great weekend, and we hope to see you in about a month's time for another exciting talk.